Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War really shouldn't even exist, and for the most part, I mean that literally. This game was an absolute miracle in the fact that it even came out at all, let alone in the relatively solid state that it did, and fully uncovering the story of how it went from almost not happening whatsoever to being one of the best received and best-selling COD games in a while is a pretty wild story. This game has multiple parts from other projects stitched onto it as well. For example, the Zombies mode, at least initially, was a Sledgehammer Games project up until Treyarch was brought on to take over and handle the production themselves. And the most important piece to the puzzle of all this, Black Ops Cold War was made right at the very start of the the exquisite Mexican beer, which is in no way, shape, or form associated with the at the time newly emerging coronavirus pandemic. Yet despite all that, I'll go on record and say that the game is pretty good, and it's got a few major problems, however, and I think the majority of those problems can be traced back to the Mexican beer thing. But in terms of big picture ideas, Black Ops Cold War is really an attempt at doing what Modern Warfare 2019 did with the Modern Warfare series, capturing the spirit of what made that original game so great for a brand new audience, and doing that for the Black Ops franchise, albeit with a slightly different approach. But largely, Cold War was an attempt to capture the spirit, as it were, in a more modern context for the gaming world. The entirety of Black Ops Cold War, as it was on launch, came together in about 7 or 8 months, which is a criminally short amount of time given the scope and scale of the things that they wanted to do. Every single time I play Cold War now, I can literally feel the COVID leaking out of every corner of the game, from its unusually short campaign to its fun but initially basic multiplayer, and then its stitched-on zombies mode. Yet despite being a game that should have by all accounts failed, financially and otherwise, it's one of the best-selling CODs, and as far as community sentiment, is generally regarded in a mostly positive light. Out of the new school era of COD games, easily my personal favorite out of these is still Cold War. And while it gets a lot of things right, there's a lot that also feels it's missing from the experience, whether for intentional design choices or because they made the game in about 4 seconds. But in any case, Cold War has probably the most interesting story behind its development, and regardless of your personal feelings about the game, you have to have some admiration for the fact that Cold War could have very well not existed whatsoever, yet they somehow rallied and were able to put this game together. And, you know, once you understand the context and the conditions that this game was created under, it makes every aspect of it make so much more sense. So let's dive a bit deeper and to understand the full context of Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Ever since Modern Warfare 2019, there's a clear divider in my mind that separates what I'm going to call old school Call of Duty with the new era, or I guess just more modern Call of Duty games. And in that modern category, Cold War is Treyarch's only current entry, and it's unfortunate in some ways because I feel like it got the short end of the stick, which is a shame because it does some extremely unique things. For example, in Modern Warfare 2019 and Vanguard and MW2 are all largely built on the same engine and are more similar games than they are dissimilar, from its visuals to its actual mechanics a lot of the time. There isn't that clear-cut difference in style that you used to have with like COD 4 and Black Ops 2, for example. You remember in years prior when Infinity Ward, Treyarch, and Sledgehammer had very clearly different takes on making a game. You could tell them apart just from their identity. You know, Infinity Ward was usually the more tonally realistic one. Treyarch had that more colorful and plasticky look, and Sledgehammer Games had that certain gloss over their titles that was super recognizable. Reason I bring this up, out of the new era COD games, Cold War still maintains that distinct, colorful, plasticky Treyarch look. It's the one that looks the most distinct compared to the rest of these titles, and it's reported that Treyarch's next game in 2024 will be on the MW2 engine, meaning it's possible that its, you know, really solid identity that the studio's known for may kind of fade away. The problem with trying to keep everything on the same engine across the board is that really pronounced look that every game had, even its feel, is starting to just merge into one. And I give Cold War still, though, a lot of props for feeling like a Treyarch game first and foremost. But the thing is, its style, it's not for everybody. Some people love that plasticky look, and some people hate it. It's unique and different, you know, to say the least, but the reason I bring that up, despite the difficult circumstances surrounding the game, for the most part, it maintains a lot of that that distinct Treyarch feel to it, which is a positive. Now, I imagine most of you know what was going on during the development of Cold War, and just as it sent shockwaves through the whole world, the gaming industry was no exception to that. The pandemic ended up being a massive handicap to Cold War's coming together as a complete experience, and there's no world imaginable in which that didn't present some kind of disadvantage. Now, I will often hear a bunch of overweight, bearded, unemployed, Reddit browsing, Discord moderating, mac and cheese consuming, maidenless nerds say that the COVID pandemic is no excuse for developers to make a bad video game.
Ever heard of Vanguard? I created Vanguard.
And in some ways, sure, it's definitely not an excuse to make poor quality games, but it is an explanation for why some things may come out the way they do, and there's a big difference. After speaking to a couple of developers myself and seeing what they went through getting Black Ops Cold War made, I have a newfound respect for the product that we did get, and as mentioned, Cold War was mid-production when COVID first struck, meaning this was the transitional period when people were trying to chaotically adapt to working from home.
We'd had the luck of getting a couple of sessions in on the stages in the full motion capture. And then when the pandemic hit, there was this horrible feeling of, well, what's going to happen?
None of us were able to really finish our performances physically.
And you can tell immediately when playing it, the awkward transition period of getting like dev kits at home and getting into a routine that works and so on. This had catastrophic effects on the final product. Voice actors were literally making scuffed DIY vocal recording studios in their houses to still be able to work on the game. The absolute length that some of these people went to in order to ensure the game was still on track is pretty admirable, to say the least.
We were recording through, the dead of summer where it was 98 degrees and I'd be trapped inside of this room for 4 hours, like screaming my brains out, just sweating. The steps that have been made during this pandemic, I think there's a lot to be gained from it.
So I have a ton of respect for the less than optimal conditions everyone involved with, the production put up with, because they were so passionate about getting something made despite the pandemic giving them every single reason not to. That being said, this new way of doing things presented its own set of obstacles and roadblocks, and I was paying extra attention when playing the game this time around, and I noticed that there's very few cutscenes with characters interacting with one another that are mocapped, particularly in the campaign. They managed to get some stuff done together, but for the most part, everyone's performance, voice acted or otherwise, was done with them being completely alone and having to act like there's other people around in the scene. And you can tell because there's just some dialogue that feels weird and disconnected.
Man, get the out of here with that shit.
And it took me out of the experience sometimes because you can tell just each actor is giving their performance in a totally isolated space, and then the engineers had to put all these individual pieces together to make it seem as if they're all reacting to each other in real time. It's definitely clunky in a bunch of moments, and as much as they tried to make it natural and as cohesive as possible, there's clearly something lost when trying to give a whole character performance over a goddamn Zoom call. And that's pretty much just to do with the campaign, but it's so apparent for the rest of the offering as well. The campaign is super short, and you'll notice is really light on actual gameplay. The multiplayer was super basic and didn't have many maps when it launched, and Zombies had one map that was already mostly done by Sledgehammer anyways. Let's just say that the game wasn't exactly filled to the brim or overflowing with content, but again, while it's not an excuse, it is an explanation. Basically, COVID made normal development a logistical nightmare, and you've got to have some sympathy for the absurd lengths these people went to get the game produced. We'll get into it soon, but the campaign, for example, has very few choreographed situations and actors at all, and of course, this was the hardest stuff to make with everyone at home or on Zoom calls. But you know what isn't as hard to do when you're at home? Dialogue. Lots and lots of dialogue.
Ironic, wouldn't you say?
And this game has so much of it. The campaign has literal trucks full of intel, items, descriptions for stuff, multiple dialogue options for every character, and so on. They probably realize, like, oh, the easiest thing for us to do right now, considering we're all at home by ourselves in front of our computers and microphones, is to write story and record tons of voice lines. You can do everything from talking extensively to Mason and Woods to rizzing up Park. Again, the campaign is very light on gameplay and very heavy on dialogue and written intel. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it should help you at least understand why Cold War's campaign is built the way that it is. It's just something I noticed and wanted to point out. Same deal with multiplayer and zombies. Like, the first zombies map doesn't even have an ending cutscene cinematic, most likely because COVID made it impossible to do at that time. However, there's about 16 million pieces of intel with dialogue that comes with them. It's just the way the cookie crumbles. You know, this happened to be the easiest stuff to make under the conditions. Another thing Cold War did pre-release, and keeping with its theme to bring Black Ops to a new generation, was its attempt to recreate GK Nova 6. Cold War had this thing called Pawn Takes Pawn, conceptually very similar to GK Nova 6. This got the whole community involved in solving encrypted TV messages and whatnot, and we had a great time doing it.
Hello lads, it's me, Call of Duty.
He joined! Treyarch joined!
Have you tried using Dienda to solve it?
The F is a Dienda, dude.
Dienda this dick!
Oh, come on, man!
You get it, lads?
Come on,
get
dude!
it? God, I'm a comedy genius!
I think the only problem with this, GK Nova 6 was truly much more raw and visceral and mysterious, and even downright scary. Like, Pawn Takes Pawn had a much lighter tone. You can see the Activision trademarks plastered all over the TV screens and stuff like that. They tried really hard to recreate the initial magic of GK Nova 6 without having any actual teeth to it. Again, it's really clear when looking at it now, Cold War was made when people were stuck at home and really had nothing to do except write, record dialogue, or make puzzles for the community. But what I find really strange about Cold War is, you know, yeah, all this stuff was tough and should have made the game a total flop and failure, but I feel quite the opposite in a lot of ways. Sure, it's definitely not as stacked with content as some of our past Treyarch titles, but the content that it does have is pretty solid, and dare I say it, really great even. With Black Ops Cold War as a whole, I think its flaws come more in the form of missed opportunities rather than its actual systems and mechanics of the game going wrong. I realize that Cold War gets a lot of stuff right, across the board, you know, all its modes. It just has so many areas where it could have gone a step further with its stuff, but, you know, it's definitely complicated. Now, I know what question you're wanting to ask. Is Colgate Whitener or Crest the superior product for having beautiful white teeth and protecting against cavities? And to answer that, I called in an expert. The following message is brought to you by an official Colgate representative.
So I know a thing or two about toothpaste, okay? I've brushed my teeth once, or, you know, even twice, and I use Colgate Max White. It says, whiter teeth in 1 week. It's a goddamn lie. My teeth are radiating yellow like the sun. They're doing backflips, left, right, and center, all over my goddamn mouth. And I've used Colgate several times, all right? And listen, people still know that I'm English, all right? It makes no sense. They still know that I'm from the UK, okay? So, if anything, Crest has to be better for my sake, okay? Because it's all I have left. It's the only hope that I have left of ridding me from the embarrassment of being from the United Kingdom.
I'm sorry about that. I got a little sidetracked. What were we talking about again? Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be reviewing a video game. Anyways, yeah, I think the best place to start with Cold War is we need to discuss its campaign. Yes, I'm talking to you from the Cold War TV this time. Hey, if you're new, subscribe. And also, I have a big announcement. I have a Patreon now where if you want to get access to these reviews early and you really like them, you can watch them before anyone else over there. So that plus behind the scenes stuff, if that interests you, go check out the Patreon. But otherwise, enjoy the video and let's continue. So, I asked you guys on Twitter about how you felt about the Black Ops Cold War campaign. This was after I had already done my playthrough and developed my own thoughts on it. The gist of what I gathered was stuff like, yeah, it was pretty good, maybe a little too short, but it was fun, or it captures the spirit of Black Ops 1, or some were a bit more critical in saying that it tried to be like Black Ops 1 campaign, but just wasn't as good as it, or, you know, I got varying answers, but for the most part, people really liked it or were at least mildly positive on it. But the thing I picked up on most was how much people feel like this campaign is similar to Black Ops 1. And I thought about that for a little bit, and I realized that Cold War's campaign is actually only similar to BO1 when it comes to subject material and topic, but structurally, this campaign I think is more similar to Black Ops 3. Let me explain why. So ignoring the obvious parallels to BO1 as far as subject matter is concerned for now, when you take a look under the hood, it has way more in common with the BO3 campaign. For example, both campaigns take place under the pretense that the majority of missions you are this like unnamed player or otherwise non-important established character. Both of them have safe houses you go to in between missions to uncover more about the plot. Both of them have a main character that the game is kind of focused on, but it's being told using said unnamed character. The Black Ops 3 campaign is sort of a story about Taylor, and the Cold War campaign is kind of a story about Adler. Both campaigns have a twist that recontextualizes the first missions. Both campaigns have a create a class or otherwise perk system where your gameplay is tuned. And finally, both have an ending sequence where everything goes off the rails dramatically in an over-the-top way visually. Basically, I think Cold War is taking the Black Ops 3 campaign structure, but giving it Black Ops 1 subject material. It's much more faithful feeling to what Black Ops typically reminds people of, but is almost nothing like BO1 structurally at all. Another obvious parallel to BO1 is its use of real historical footage. While I like how stylish it feels in Cold War, I stand by my statement that you can really tell the footage is a bit more tame compared to what they used to do in BO1. I'm not saying we need to be overly graphic about it, but you can tell Treyarch had to be a lot more careful and selective about what footage they could and could not use. Some things probably just wouldn't fly in video games anymore. It's still effectively used, it's just far less gritty than in World at War or in BO1, you can clearly tell. Something else that complicates this campaign is that now Call of Duty tends to continue telling the story of the game through seasonal trailer events and so on. It gets really messy and complicated when you factor that stuff in. And frankly, nobody really cares when it's delivered in this way, so I don't care if there's a part of the campaign that doesn't really make sense that gets explained later in a seasonal cutscene or whatever. The campaign and story is presented as one standalone package, and it will be reviewed and judged as such. So essentially, the premise of the game is set during the Reagan administration and the Cold War. And another key factor to note, Modern Warfare 2019 was set in a totally different universe than COD 4. However, Black Ops Cold War is set in the same timeline still, but it takes place in between the events of Black Ops 1 and 2. While BO1 set out to be a game around that same time frame, it was not trying to be about the literal Cold War. BO1 was about the secret operations that were taking place around it. Black Ops Cold War, however, is, how the name suggests, this is covering more of the literal, more well-established historical material when it comes to, Perseus and different operations going on, the secret Soviet sleeper agents, MK Ultra, which was a government programming technique, the Manhattan Project, and so on. Its themes and events being referenced are pretty on the nose and obvious. Let me give you an analogy for how I see the Black Ops Cold War campaign. It's like you're at a restaurant and you order a meal, and it's one of those upscale joints that, sell super small portions. Black Ops Cold War is like the best filet or like small bits of steak you've ever had in your life. That is to say, the main meat of this game is so damn good, but you have to chew through a ton of salad to get to it. This campaign has some of the best gameplay sequences in COD ever, but proportionally speaking, the size is incredibly small, and everything surrounding it is just salad. This is salad, this is salad, this is salad, this is salad, and this is also salad. And, the chef in this case knows that this is salad, but if the dish didn't have all of that salad, it would expose how truly little quantity there is to this campaign. Again, I love the main mission stuff, but you can tell the rest of all of this is just fluff to make up for the not-so-lengthy main campaign.
But there's always a weakness.
Okay, so the basic premise of this game is that there's this entire ring of individuals all tied to this man named Perseus. He has lower level people working for him as well, and the game opens up with Creed Bratton from The Office telling you about two men who are involved in a situation that you can use to get info on Perseus.
Mr. President, we have two names linked to the hostage situation.
And that there was a nuke that was stolen and in control of the Soviets that you need to track down. You start out the first mission as Mason, and you're following around Adler and Woods to track down and get get down this first man. What's interesting in this campaign is, again, you can tell they were writing a lot. There's different dialogue options to get different responses. This is a mechanic throughout the whole campaign, and it does play a role in what ending you get. However, most choices do not affect the ultimate outcome of the game until the very end. You know, short-term stuff or side missions can be a little altered depending on your behavior or dialogue choices. Hey, wait a second. Why does that guy have a picture from the video game on his newspaper in the video game? But for the ultimate outcome of the game, this stuff actually typically doesn't matter. So in order to get info on the next suspect, you interrogate this first guy. You, Woods, and Adler go to an airfield to stop Arash, and in doing so, Arash claims Perseus is already in action and his plan is currently in motion against the West.
Perseus will watch the West.
This and the next cutscene give you the whole setup of the game. There's a few key players linked to Perseus and his ring of influence. Ronald Reagan gives you the brief and allows you whatever means necessary to contain the Perseus situation, get the stolen nuke, and maintain security for the West. This includes letting Adler do what he wants and, more importantly, recruit people who may be slightly unconventional. Also, for some reason, Hudson cannot say the word nuclear correctly to save his life.
Attempted to steal an American-made nuclear bomb from a U.S. firebase. Nuclear bomb. Perseus smuggled a nuclear device through East Berlin. He's a nuclear engineer based out of Salt Lake City, detonating nuclear bombs in every major European city.
So let's talk about the gameplay for a second. This is where one of the coolest mechanics of Cold War comes into play. You get to develop the name and psychological profile of your main playable character, Bell. These psychological traits give you perks in-game, i.e. more bullet damage, maybe you carry extra grenades, more health, or you have less damage flinch, etc. This is the first time in a little while that COD really let you change your in-game character attributes again. It's a dope mechanic for sure, but it's kind of weird when you really think about how light this campaign is on, you know, the point-and-shoot gameplay, and this has so much emphasis in the beginning. It's a very weird juxtaposition, but it has both a gameplay function and a narrative function at the same time. It's just a cool way of differentiating the gameplay in a simple and straightforward way. Also, you realize the majority of missions have nothing to do with these aspects. A lot of the time, you're doing stealth things, or you're making choices, or you're doing much more adventure game-based stuff rather than, you know, shooting and Call of Duty stuff. It seems like a missed opportunity to have some perks that alter those things as well, like maybe lockpicking proficiency, or maybe you have like better interrogation skills, etc. But the way it meshes with the actual gameplay is just fine, and I'm a big fan of that. I just feel like it could have gone into those aspects and played a role as well. But let's talk about the gameplay and why it's just so weird for a Call of Duty campaign. So it opens, you know, pretty normally. You get a setup and then right into some gunplay and action. But after mission 1, you're thrown to a safe house, and here you can immediately start doing side content if you want to. The way you access missions is through this evidence board, and if you choose to do side missions and not the main ones, these are more traditional COD missions as far as I can tell, where they have, you know, there's a plethora of point and shoot gameplay, but you can really feel the lack of polish or otherwise moments and features that make up a main COD mission are just not there. There's not really like cutscenes and stuff like that. It's a little hollow and not very consequential at all to the overall main outcome of the game. Also, doing side content, whether, you know, you're hunting down the crime ring or whatever, has no bearing on which ending you get. Now, let's say you just do main missions. Typically, you're playing as Bell, and Adler is walking you through the process of trying to get more info on Perseus, his locations and plans. Occasionally, you will switch to Mason and teaming up with Woods. You'll try to secure the nukes that are in possession of the Soviets, running these ops for Hudson. You'll notice a lot of these missions are set up in a way where there's a lot of choices you can make, either through dialogue, maybe choosing someone to save, like killing someone or not, and so on. Like the mission called Desperate Measures, while there's almost no gunplay in the whole level, it's so clever and creative. It's like that one mission in the World War II campaign where you're like sneaking around and you have this like fake identity, but Cold War does this with so much more depth and sophistication this time around. You have a few key things you need to accomplish, but you get like I don't know, hundreds of different ways you can go about getting to your destination. I think this is my favorite level in the whole game easily, despite there being almost no gunplay at all. Most of the main levels follow the structure where it's more or less about decision making. It's such a different vibe to just about every other COD campaign that you can compare it to, it borders on not even feeling like Call of Duty at times. Now, let's circle back to the story. So, while Adler and Bell are typically working through recalling memories to find clues or hints, names, faces, etc., that might point them towards Perseus, Mason and Woods end up discovering that the nuke that was stolen that they undercovered in Soviet control is actually American. This failure of Hudson to tell them the truth makes each of them a little bit more distrustful of Hudson, but he reveals this was part of Project Greenlight all along, in which bombs would be set off all over Europe in the event of a Soviet invasion. Hudson slips in a little hint, talking about the truth and points to Adler as someone who should know about that stuff.
Only who you choose to believe. Adler knows all about that. Don't you, Russ?
With the help of your inside man Belikov, you're able to get some really good internal intel on the stolen nuke, Perseus' next move, and that sort of thing, but something that really bothers me here is apparently this ties the Modern Warfare universe and the Black Ops universe together. But did we really need Zakhaev to be this guy? Like, he doesn't have much function in this campaign at all, other than just being Zakhaev. Like, this could have easily just has been any other bad guy, but it had to be Zakhaev because Call of Duty. So after that whole situation, Creed from the office is like, hey, there's a scientist sleeper agent that Perseus is going to likely try and use. This might be a good opportunity to intercept him, get some information about the stolen nuke and Project Greenlight and everything else. However, during this mission, things go very wrong. The intel was slightly off, and Perseus actually executes the scientist, and you get ambushed on the rooftops when trying to escape, when the game gives you a choice to make. You only have time to save Lazar or Park. And fellas, like, keep it a stack with me. I know who y'all picked, but in terms of the story's canon, Park is also the one that actually survives anyways. But with this botched mission and recovery, Adler's like, oh my god, I'm sick of this, and it's time to pull out the big guns. With all of these attempts to, extract details from Bell and use his, cryptography skills to get information about Perseus, they were really unable to get all the info they needed. It feels like this entire campaign was built as a lead up to this one mission. I could be wrong, but it seems like they had an idea for this level and decided to build almost a whole story around it, because it's easily the best mission in the game by a mile, not including the Desperate Measures one, and it's also the most important level in the game as far as what ending you get and understanding the twist, which we're going to get to. So the premise of this level is Bell gets a spinal injection and Adler is walking you through your memories by talking to you. The details that he describes dictates the conditions of the level as far as what weapons you have and the enemies and so on, but in the level, Adler will tell you what you did. But you have the choice to disobey and really kind of go wherever you want or take different paths. The more you disobey and mess around, Adler will become increasingly more frustrated and desperate. Every new injection, the level resets, but gets more and more twisted and distorted. This is what I meant when I say this whole campaign is like the best steak you've ever had. But to get to it, you have to eat through a whole lot of salad first. Treyarch really shows their expertise and creativity in this level specifically, and how things become more and more twisted in that traditional Black Ops fashion. Visually and design-wise, I think it's one of the best levels in Call of Duty's history, and maybe even one of the best missions ever. In fact, things can get so off the rails if you push Adler to his limits, and you can end up in like this dark cave filled with zombies where things are just beyond distorted at this point. The point of this level is for Bell to spill the beans about where Perseus said he would be after detonating the nukes with Project Greenlight. And even if you keep disobeying and things become mega distorted, eventually you still have to walk through this door at some point and encounter Perseus. Now, this is where the ultimate fate of your game gets decided. All of the choices in terms of dialogue, who you do or do not save, or any other minor choice that you decided to pursue in the game, none of that matters until now. Adler asks you a question, and your response determines one of three outcomes. You can tell Adler the truth, you can lie to him and not tell Perseus their plans, or you can lie to Adler and tell Perseus your plans and let him in on it. In that case, the team shows up to the wrong location, Bell kills the rest of the team, including Park and Woods, etc. Adler dies, and this is the worst ending intended for shock value. The other ending is lying to Adler, but not telling Perseus. Adler eventually sniffs you out and kills Bell instead after the nukes went off. And the final ending is telling Adler the truth. You go to the real location that Perseus said he would be and prevent Project Greenlight from detonating. I don't really like the gameplay of this last mission. The one before it was such a good finale, but this level plays like a literal filler mission, assuming you're doing the proper ending. It feels so tacked on and only exists to wrap up the story. The gameplay feels so hollow compared to the previous level, and what's revealed through all of this, and why I compare it to Black Ops 3, it's revealed that Bell is one of the 2 Soviet soldiers that Arash shot in the car on the airfield before he got on that plane. Adler swept the area, and then he found you alive and used MK Ultra to implant memories with Adler so that you would trust him. The whole Vietnam thing, Bell wasn't even actually there for, and you can tell Adler didn't even have a scar on his face in that mission. Also, looking at the evidence for stuff, Bell is nowhere to be found in these photographs at all. Adler implanted him with these memories so that he'd cooperate with them in their pursuit to find Perseus. In fact, the name Bell is used by Adler as a sort of code word. Adler's phrase, "We have a job to do," is the trigger.
We've got a job to do.
That's why Bell could already read fluent Russian and use his cryptography skills or whatever. My only problem with the story twist is, like, they don't really let you put it together yourself. They have to outright show you what the twist was. A little subtlety here I think would have been nice. Also, the name Bell is kind of like stupid and obvious a little bit. Like, they may as well have called him Pavlov's dog, for Christ's sake. It felt like they wanted to do the same twist as Black Ops 3, more or less, but most people didn't even catch on to what the twist was in that game at all, so they had to spell it out for you in this one. And that's fine, I suppose, but it doesn't leave anything up to interpretation or speculation. Bell was a nobody, essentially. Adler reprogrammed him. Adler underwent reprogramming in his own past as well, and the ending is Adler talking to Bell one last time, and then they end on a cliffhanger.
That's why when I ask you for one more, I hope you understand. It was never personal.
Oh my god, this is exciting. I wonder who shot first. Is Bell still alive, or did Adler live? Maybe we're gonna find out in the next game. Oh, I guess Adler just lived.
Man, get the out of here with that shit.
I had a hard time figuring out exactly where this campaign falls for me in the grand scheme of things. Like I said, it has a lot of super well-crafted and creative moments. There are some awesome levels in here, but there's just not a whole lot of them. Everything else is just basically solid. Again, you may have enjoyed them, you know, the side missions and the dialogue strings with different characters and whatnot, and overall, I really like this campaign. But I will say, due to the difficult development, it's clear where it was hindered. The character choice and, you know, therefore multiple endings aren't handled nearly as well as they were in Black Ops 2. The story doesn't have the subtle genius in the writing like Black Ops 1, and it doesn't do its twist quite as interesting to me as Black Ops 3 did. In all other areas, it succeeds greatly for me. It's not the best campaign at any one thing in particular, but it doesn't do anything outright bad either. In fact, I'd even say it's definitely one of the better ones, especially when just focusing on main content specifically. In any case, part of its world building and storytelling is dampened by the following seasons and how they kind of have to drag out the story from there. It has, you know, good little charming moments that are nice callbacks to the original Black Ops without coming across as outright fan service. I think it utilized Mason and Woods perfectly without them essentially running the show. It does enough genuinely different and interesting, and I found it to be quite fun, but I just couldn't get over how unusual the length of the main story is when you're not doing the obvious side content. I would have liked to see what this campaign would have turned out had Treyarch not had the handicap of the pandemic when developing this one, but it's impressive how well it turned out despite all that though, and it's fundamentally the basis for every other part of the game, multiplayer and zombies included. Ask me 2 years ago how I felt about Cold War's multiplayer, and I think I'd have a totally different answer for you about it compared to today. I feel that Cold War's multiplayer mode has evolved and morphed so much since its day one launch, you know, everything in terms of tone, maps, weapons, and meta, operators, identity, and so on. Like, everything has changed. This is the nature of the beast with live service games. When all is said and done, the end product is usually very different to the day one product that it started as. Now, you're probably wondering, did Cold War multiplayer change for the better or for worse after all of its updates and content additions? It's hard to say for sure, but I feel like this multiplayer is tonally and aesthetically trying to be like Black Ops 1. Mechanically, it plays a little bit more like Modern Warfare 2019, but with Treyarch's spin on it, and with some Black Ops 2 and 4 properties. Cold War feels like a blend of every Treyarch multiplayer, really except Black Ops 3, I think. One of the things I noticed immediately was the return to much more traditional map design, or at least the base maps on Cold War feel like they could have easily been cut from Black Ops 1 or 2, but they work really well in this game. The weird thing is, as the season went on, Treyarch added tons of old fan favorite maps into Cold War from pretty much all their games. That's a big reason why you feel the blend of these older titles be so heavy in this one. We'll get to core gameplay in just a second because I have a lot to say about it, but in terms of sheer identity and tone and how the game feels, I think Cold War MP struggles the most here. Even if some MPs in the past I didn't really like or thought had, you know, super great gameplay or anything, a lot of them had really strong identities at least. The problem with Cold War, as far as I can tell, is it relies so heavily on nostalgic maps and guns and even operators and kill streaks, etc., that it struggles to really capture and crystallize a real solid identity of its own. Cold War multiplayer has such a hard time being distinct, and, you know, I suspect a lot of that has to do with COVID, as it did hinder the campaign as well as the multiplayer. It just borrows so much stuff from past games to make up the experience. I mean, like, the kill streaks are kind of a blend of Modern Warfare 2019 and Black Ops 1. The maps are literally old Treyarch maps for the most part, and the guns feel like reiterations of BO1 and stuff like that. But I think you get my point. In terms of how the game actually plays mechanically and the moment-to-moment, you know, 30-second gameplay loop, I actually find Cold War ridiculously fun. It has that indescribable feeling and magic that you get with each Treyarch MP. The kills and kill streaks really feel some type of way. Speaking of which, this brings up a very interesting topic, and perhaps the part that I dislike about Cold War multiplayer the most: the unnecessary and complicated streak system. We've seen plenty of iterations of the streak system and that formula over the long time that Call of Duty has featured them. Initially, just kill streaks, and then, you know, eventually they became score streaks, and then point streaks, and every other variant that we've seen. Cold War has one of the most bizarre and experimental spins on this formula ever. So basically, the streaks work similar in a way that the MW3 support items were, where basically every kill streak here does not reset upon death, but when getting kills, you get a multiplier for your score earned. So of course, if you manage to get like 7 or 8 kills in a row, having a score multiplier of 8 is going to get you streaks that much faster. But I think that this system is just so extra for no real reason. It's basically just kill streaks with extra steps and trying to do the math in your head while playing a game. Like, it's just kind of weird, and it's like, you know, it's not like everybody's rolling chopper gunners every game, even though your score doesn't reset on them, because practically speaking, the system works more or less the same as kill streaks. It just isn't as adrenaline pumping or exciting when your streaks are never at risk of resetting, or at least it is to me anyways. I've never really grown to like this system. It's confusing for no reason. It doesn't serve some other end goal better. I mean, like, the actual score streaks themselves are fine, and I would even say they're pretty good, but it seems like they did it because otherwise Cold War wouldn't have really anything to offer that's special on its own. It's the first ever Treyarch MP since Black Ops 2 to not have Specialist as its core player mechanic. It does have the carryover from Black Ops 4, in which players have a visible health bar, which isn't a big deal to me, just didn't feel like it was as important here as it was in BO4, but it's still a fine touch. Cold War's movement feels sort of similar to Modern Warfare 2019 as well. It's slightly less effective to slide cancel and stuff, but can still be utilized well here. It also has a very similar feel to Modern Warfare in its attachment system and the gunsmith. This was Treyarch's game, you know, the first title to like transition into that new style of gunsmithing that we've seen take place since then. And for the first attempt at it, I'm gonna be honest, for Treyarch multiplayer, I really don't like it. I think it's good in Modern Warfare and the new Modern Warfare 2. Infinity Ward usually handles the more realistic approach to weapons and attachments a bit better, but something that I've always loved about Treyarch was just how like distinct and important every attachment felt in older games. It's like, you know, it's a little more cartoony and their attachments can be a bit more silly feeling, but that's totally fine. That's their style. But Treyarch leaning towards this, you know, this new gunsmith system does take away from that initial charm that I feel like some of that had. I think going forward, I would like to see Treyarch use the old attachment system more and Infinity Ward continue with the brand new gunsmithing system. It would give each game a nice blend as well, instead of them all feeling the same. Another thing, speaking to its identity, the biggest difference between classic and modern Call of Duty was the fact that the factions, voice lines, art, character models, etc. were all really well pronounced. In Cold War and most of the newer COD games, there's like 2 factions max, with some blending of factions, specific operators for each team. Cold War doesn't really have a strong sense of team identity either way anymore. This is made even worse by the operators, the crazy looking skins that you can have, and then also the items become so ridiculous that at some point they do breach the tone that the game is trying to retain. Look, I'm perfectly okay with a little bit of silliness in your game, and some things out of pocket here and there can be fun and add to the experience, but at some point it does cross the line and it eats into that identity. Vanguard has this problem way worse, but we're gonna get to that, you know, someday later on. The time to kill in Cold War also feels nice, and it always has, and it gets a lot of stuff objectively right on paper from a pure gameplay perspective, but it has just such a hard time coming together as one like memorable package in my eyes. And the more I sit here and look at it, I was scrolling through the maps and the weapons and everything, I was like, damn, like Cold War is really just Black Ops 2 remastered, pretty much. Like everybody's crying for a BO2 remaster. In a lot of ways, this is it.
Alright guys, which game is better? Call of Duty Cold War or Black Ops 2? Black Ops 2, of course, yeah!
In terms of class customization, perks, and progression, it's like a blend of Modern Warfare and Black Ops 1. Because Cold War has no specialists anymore, you do have your extra field upgrade, and that is in some sense your ability, but they are a lot more subtle in the meta of the typical multiplayer experience. This definitely feels like them trying to get back in touch with their roots and provide a more traditional Black Ops multiplayer, albeit with some more, you know, modern and updated mechanics. The main problem is I can't really think of any one specific detail or feature that fundamentally sets this one apart in a good way. World at War, you know, iconic for a number of reasons. Black Ops 1, legendary for identity, classic weapons and maps and kill streaks. BO2 has some of the most personality of any multiplayer game ever and is overflowing with it. Black Ops 3, you know, controversial, but was still special and had characters, you know, jetpack movement, etc. Black Ops 4, also controversial, but had specialists, you know, these really interesting team-based mechanics and so on. Cold War doesn't really have any one thing that makes it unique other than its weird-ass kill streak system. And to make matters even worse, this was the first Treyarch game to take away the emblem editor feature. Again, this was such an iconic part of previous titles that I really think helped establish it as this memorable thing, but Cold War doesn't have it. It has, you know, these pre-packaged emblems that have basically been a staple in COD for the past couple of years or so, and I wonder if it's because people, you know, have used it inappropriately or whatever, or just because they didn't have time to add it. I'm not sure if it was a COVID thing or what. Who knows? But it's not in the game, and I think it really does hurt the experience. Cold War has some interesting ideas and maps and weapons on its own, and again, its visual style and the core gameplay I actually enjoy so much. It feels so good to play. I'd also like to point out that it has a fairly large variety of experiences offered as far as game modes and custom games, prop hunt, stuff like that. Typically, a game's DLC maps will either be an extension of the already existing ones or will be a bit more experimental. Cold War's post-launch maps are like just totally for fan service, and as I was playing it again, it seemed like every map that I was on was a map from BO1 or 2 with an occasional Cold War original here and there. Like, it's fascinating to see how these maps would play in a slightly different movement system and weapon sandbox. I'm okay with that. And players having a totally different toolkit with Cold War's field upgrades and equipment, it's, you know, it's a finely paced game and the gunplay feels great. I just feel this one is really hard to nail down and talk about one specific element because it's more or less just a blending of older things we've already dissected before. I found Cold War's multiplayer to be much more fun than, you know, some titles in years past like World War II for sure. And I feel very much the same way about the MP that I do about the campaign. There just isn't a whole lot going on here, but the stuff that it does have, you know, tastes pretty damn good. The best way to put it in a box is that Treyarch is taking a step back and trying to get back to home base with this one. That means it lost a lot of what made it special in some other titles, but I also think it gives them a good clean slate to build on this MP going forward in their future games. I enjoyed my time thoroughly, but I can't help but feel this MP won't really have a lasting impression on me anytime soon, for better or for worse. So, this isn't the first time I've given a deep review to Cold War Zombies. Some of you may have seen the retrospective I made on the mode a little over a year ago at this point, and for those of you who watched it, I am going to be reiterating a lot of what I said in that video, but also some time has passed and my opinions on some things have changed and evolved, and I've had more developments in my thinking about Cold War Zombies since I've posted that video. So with that being said, just like the rest of the game, we really have to acknowledge the crunch and pressure this Zombies mode was made under. It was understaffed, under-resourced, underfunded, and had hardly any time. But what I find really curious about Cold War Zombies is how, in my opinion, a lot of its design choices feel like a direct response to the criticism of Black Ops 4 Zombies. It gets a lot of things right or improves upon some ideas that Black Ops 4 introduced or just completely backtracked on others. Just as a few examples, you know, the Pack-a-Punch system will now show you what tier your gun is upgraded to, alongside having a visual camo indicator and a large damage buff alongside it. It reeled zombies back to be in a bit more approachable to the average gamer. Pack-a-Punch in every single Cold War map is a relatively straightforward and easy process. Black Ops 3 and 4 are the biggest offenders of having long and drawn-out processes to get to Pack-a-Punch. Broad stroke, this is the attitude that Cold War Zombies takes on, especially when it comes to Easter eggs and main quests, which we'll get to in a moment. But before we get to the nitty-gritty of maps and Easter eggs, I want to talk about some of the systems that define Cold War's mechanics, and really explore the ideas that I like and dislike about the overall structure. I've said it once, I'll say it again. Cold War Zombies' flaws are more in the form of its missed opportunities rather than its systems not working. In other words, Cold War Zombies' core gameplay loop is pretty damn solid and honestly doesn't have many holes, but it's painfully obvious at times when it feels like something is lacking or could have been taken a step farther. For example, in the launch map, Die Maschine, one of its core elements of the map is going to the Dark Ether. This is required for Pack-a-Punch as well as many steps of the main Easter egg. However, you can feel how painfully underused this condition really is. There's so much cool stuff they could have done with this concept, but it more or less dies here in Die Maschine with very little impact on the map that it's supposed to be important in, and pretty much never appears at any other point in the game. In fact, pre-alpha footage shows a way more visually interesting and potentially more mechanically important Dark Ether concept. Another thing Cold War gets criticized a lot for is its lack of personality. I hear most people say this, but they don't really talk about what that actually means. And I think from my perspective, I think I can tell you what that means when people say the game has no personality, and it is a valid complaint. Cold War maps are more or less a bad guy facility. Sure, you have your different locations, atmospheres, etc., and that helps to keep it grounded and have that classic Zombies feel if you like that, but also, the problem is each map more or less has the exact same sandbox too, meaning perks, guns, crafting table items, and so on. Like, you can think of Cold War maps as just being different layouts of more or less the same sandbox and therefore set of tools consistently map to map, so that nothing feels distinct or different. Think about this. In Mob of the Dead, that is the only map in Zombies to feature a physical electric cherry perk machine. Yeah, the perk is in other maps, sure, but when you try to think of like buying electric cherry from a machine, that memory or thought is always associated associated with Mob of the Dead, thus giving that map some purpose and identity. Same idea with the giant robots on Origins or the monkeys on Ascension. Like, there's a million examples, but the point is something that can only be found on a specific map that's catering towards its specific theme and purpose. Cold War is really lacking in this area. Essentially, the only things that set the maps apart are wonder weapons and side Easter eggs. Everything else in the map is the same from experience to experience when boiled down, and that equates to what a lot of people call no personality, if you ask me, on top of the maps themselves feeling very samey across the board. And operators definitely don't help either. A lot of people take issue with the operators and the experience, and I agree to some extent. It does take away from the identity that the, experience could have. I think an easy solution for this is to have both operators and a cannon crew, but sort of like in World War II Zombies, where you, for the most part, started as a cannon crew and you did challenges, you could unlock operators and then optionally play as them later on. I think going forward, Treyarch would, do well to implement that into their game. Now, when it comes to main Easter eggs, this is where Cold War Zombies differs the most from BO4 and even BO3, and its strategy has some real advantages and drawbacks. The biggest differences in Easter egg design are virtually eliminating almost all stuff like random spawn locations or arbitrary and random steps and whatnot. If you want a more fleshed out description of where these games differ in that regard, I recommend you watch this video. The one I made last year was meant to focus in a little more thoroughly on zombies, and that will give you basically a more in-depth explanation. But the advantage in the Cold War strategy is that these Easter eggs are fun and easily repeatable without the need to watch an hour-long Easter egg guide telling you where 6 million different items are. The Collectathon scavenger hunt short list for Easter eggs is almost all eliminated. This is great because it reels it back to being much more integrated with the actual core gameplay. I always feel like a lot of Black Ops 4's Easter egg steps, there was such a friction between the, having to sit still and work out these puzzle steps where the zombies just kind of feel like an afterthought, or they just happen to be there as you're doing puzzles, but they're more just like coincidental and they just happen to also be in the map. They're not really integrated well into the actual gameplay. Feels like the zombies don't even really need to be there. Cold War fixes this brilliantly, and the Easter egg steps, for the most part, flow well with the natural gameplay loop of killing zombies. The biggest downside to this approach is that every Easter egg was solved initially in less than 5 or 6 hours at maximum, while previous maps may have taken us as the community maybe days or even weeks to solve. Cold War's initial hunts were over so quick that it made them feel significantly less exciting when solving the main quest. And this is stuff that I've reiterated in that older video, which again, go check out if you really want an in-depth explanation about this stuff. But since then, I believe I have something that may be a solution to this problem. Many fans hate how spelled out and simple the Cold War Easter eggs can be, which is totally fair, and I hear you on that. Many people also hate how doing basic things in older maps became so unnecessarily convoluted and complicated for no real reason other than to stretch out the total running time, basically adding artificial fluff to the quote-unquote difficulty, which is also totally fair. And I believe the solution for this going forward in future Zombies maps, imagine we separate the function of main quest and Easter egg. In a given map, we have a main quest, i.e. a Cold War style Easter egg, right? Straightforward, easily repeatable without a guide, and can be challenging, but they're, pretty simple to do. It's sort of like the new raids in Modern Warfare 2. They're not necessarily hard to solve, but the execution can be, range from easy to difficult. And then you could have a proper Easter egg, which is, a lot more of a complicated Easter egg of the past with arbitrary and maybe some illogical steps that might take a very long time to solve, and perhaps they might even be hard to repeat. But this way, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have our more gameplay-oriented stuff and more logic puzzle-based steps as well that can serve totally different purposes. Maybe you'll get different story bits depending on what you do, or different rewards. I don't know. Will that ever happen? Who the hell knows? I'm just a guy in his mid-20s that spends his free time over-analyzing video games. But I really do think there's a marrying of those two styles of Easter egg design that I could see really working in future Zombies games. Now, to be perfectly transparent, spoiler alert, in general, I really like Cold War Zombies, but I do want to talk about my least favorite aspect of it really quickly. In Call of Duty Zombies in particular, I really dislike what I call out-of-game progression. As an idea, this is unlocking and equipping things in a menu that alter your in-game experience. World at War to Black Ops 2 had no systems that need to be like leveled up or adjusted to perform well in-game. Black Ops 3 had some of it, a little bit of out-of-game progression in the form of like weapon kits and gobblegums. It's definitely there. It is a lot more subtle in that game. Black Ops 4 and Cold War are the worst examples of this. In my opinion, it goes against everything that made zombies special initially. The charm of the mode was the fact that anyone and everyone was working with the exact same set of tools, and what determined your performance was how proficiently and creatively you use those tools in-game, meaning all of the progression within the match took place inside the match itself. And a little bit of out-of-game progression is perhaps fine, and I could go on forever about those older games, but I do want to dial in on Cold War Zombies specifically. And in this game, you use an item called Ethereum Crystals to upgrade virtually every item in the game, including all weapon classes and perks and field upgrades. There's a few major issues with this besides what I've already mentioned. For starters, it's pretty easy to get these crystals, and you can just upgrade everything to max stats once, and for the rest of Cold War Zombies, you literally upgrade these things and just never think about it again. The system, to you, as far as you're concerned, is dead. And also, with the addition of DLC perks, extra skill tiers, etc., the game gets power creep super hard. You do become an overpowered demon at some point for sure. And this system is primarily responsible for why people say Cold War Zombies is too easy. In fact, I'd go so far as to say you cannot be of the opinion that this out-of-game progression is good in Cold War and at the same time complain that the game is too easy. Those run contradictory to each other. And generally speaking, Cold War is perceived as an easier zombies game, but it's only the power-creeped version that's easy. Like, playing Cold War Zombies with no DLC, no Ethereum upgrades or weapon kits, it's pretty much just as hard as any other zombies game we've gotten easily. It's on par with everything else. I'm not a big fan of that stuff, and it only got worse and worse as more perks were added to the game. The balance of Cold War Zombies was built around the day one offering and rules, and you know, so much power creep got added post-launch that yes, of course it's going to break the game and make it feel easy. In my opinion, Treyarch needs to ditch completely or really pull back on a lot of this out-of-game progression stuff. And the last thing I want to touch on before we get into maps, kind of going hand in hand with the game being easy, I typically see people saying that high rounds themselves are also way too easy in Cold War. And yeah, fair enough for the reasons we just discussed, but how do you fix it? This is going to sound like a weird question, but I'm being serious. I ask you, what is a high round? Is a high round defined by the literal number, basically, you know, 50 to 100 or 200? Is the number, regardless of the context, is what constitutes a high round? Or is a high round defined by the proportion of people who can't or won't reach it? In other words, in World at War, when Zombies was a baby, round 30 was a high round because proportionally, most players were never reaching that. In Black Ops 1, and even Black Ops 2, 50 to 100 was generally considered the golden standard for high rounds. Most people still weren't achieving those numbers. Fast forward to Cold War, round 100 is more accessible to obtain than ever before. So that begs the question, is 100 even a high round anymore in the context of this game, since most players are able to achieve this if they wanted? I typically go with that. A high round is judged by the amount of players that cannot or will not achieve it. So yes, in a lot of ways, Cold War did break the idea of high rounds, making some small tweaks in the gameplay balance that I discussed in that older video could help alleviate that problem, but maybe because Cold War set out to be a more accessible game this time, it's not such a bad thing in this title, but it just means that the power creep and high rounding is somewhat easier. So of course, if you want these general subjects dissected a bit more thoroughly, feel free to watch another video. But finally, let's talk about maps and fundamentally why Cold War Zombies is so beloved by some and just seen as mediocre by others. So, Die Maschine is the only map that Cold War Zombies initially had on launch, and like I said earlier, this was a map that was primarily already developed by Sledgehammer Games, but Treyarch added their own flair later on once they took control of this thing. And you can tell, you can definitely feel the Sledgehammer influence radiating through a lot of the bones of Die Maschine, but as you progress through the map and just immediately on loading it up, it has that very like World War II Zombies feel, where the game is more or less guiding you to at least turn on the power and get Pack-a-Punch. The quest for that that is very cut and dry, it's straightforward, and the game is going to be gentle about how it guides you. Yeah, it can be a little forward at times, especially when you're going down the facility. It practically makes you go there at some point, but for the most part, D Machine is very, very beginner friendly, and that's the way they designed the map that way on purpose, which is even more clear when we get to the boss fight and Easter egg in just a second. But the way D Machine is designed is to basically, like, it will gently guide you until you turn on the power, and also, I would say, get Pack-a-Punch, and by that point, you've seen and interacted with the Dark Ether at least once, and then from that point forward, you can literally take the game into your own hands and do whatever you like. You can try to tackle the main Easter egg, or you could just play for survival and high rounds, or you can just do challenges and stuff like that. The game at that point really allows you to be off the rails and take the game wherever you want, which is a good addition. And I like the idea of the literal location itself. Like, I mentioned this before, but because it's Nocturne Toten, you know, the first ever zombies map from World at War, it does have this feeling of, like, coming home in a sense, but it doesn't focus so much on Nocturne Toten. That's, like, what it's all about. Most times I play D Machine, I don't even register this map 90% of the time as, oh, I'm in Nocturne Toten. It kind of, like, it never really crosses my mind that much because it's so, like, tastefully done in the map. It has enough new things going on its own where D Machine can stand on its own 2 feet and not just be relying on zombies nostalgia in some sense. Now, as far as the Easter egg goes, it is very straightforward and pretty easy in a lot of regards, which is okay. You basically flip back and forth in the Dark Ether and you, like, do different tasks, bring journals to different ghosts and gather intel, you interact with computers. It's got some really neat concepts in this, and again, it pretty much eliminates all of the unnecessary scavenger hunting or multiple spawn locations for stuff. It's a very easily repeatable experience, and that will take you to the map's boss fight. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in love with D Machine's boss fight. I've made the case that, like, I did enjoy initially the fact that it deviated away from the, like, 3-phase deal damage to the main boss kind of formula. Like, I was getting a bit bored of that, to be quite honest. Like, it had been a thing since kind of, I don't know, like, Black Ops 3 and BO4 did a lot of that too, and it was wearing on me a little bit. I was ready for something new. So initially, this boss fight I was a big fan of, but the problem is there's no stakes to this, and I've said it before, but the main problem is Orlov is the guy that you're supposed to defend throughout this entire situation, but he cannot die. So the problem is there's no real stakes to be proficient in defending him because there's actually no real threat of failure other than you, the player, dying. So as long as you can manage to stay alive, this boss fight can end up in a bit of a stalemate. Yeah, there's this kind of like parkour bit near the end where you gotta, like, kind of, you know, bob and weave between these things to get down to the helicopter, and that step's a lot of fun too. As a whole experience, it's not the most, like, complex Easter egg we've ever gotten, but I don't think it needed to be, and it's not even the best boss fight. But the case that I made is that D Machine is perfect at being an introductory map. A lot of people's first ever Easter egg in Zombies was D Machine because it's very accessible and people, you know, can do it with, you know, relative ease, and I think that got a lot of people in to the idea of doing Easter eggs. So I was like, hey, in the future, it would be good if Treyarch can maybe, you know, crank up the difficulty on some of these or whatever. This is a great map to get people in the door, but they can take it a step farther as the DLC season goes on. Unfortunately, I think D Machine's biggest weakness is the fact that there are hardly any meaningful side Easter eggs. There's, like, maybe 1 or 2 that are worth doing or are kind of fun. Everything else is just, like, either not worth it, it's not very exciting, or it really doesn't even need to be in the game, or it's non-existent. D Machine is maybe the most, like, dead Zombies map as far as, like, other things to do that are not the main quest, and I guarantee you most of that is a result directly of COVID, the time restraints, etc. So I can't exactly blame them for that, but D Machine is very lacking in that regard. But all things considered, like I said, the best strength is it is an excellent beginner map, and then that would lead on to the first DLC map in Cold War, Firebase Z. This map released, and this is where we could start to tell what the tone of the rest of the DLC season was going to generally look like. You know, these DLC maps are more or less using the scraps and other pieces from the campaign or the multiplayer to make up the experience. Like, D Machine is, you know, largely disconnected from everything, but still has elements and assets from the campaign and multiplayer. Firebase Z is kind of just a, you know, interesting rearranging of some of the village missions in the campaign, using those assets and stuff and making it into a zombies map with a very traditional layout with the, like, central hub area and then a few delineating areas off to the sides. Firebase Z takes place in an abandoned Omega facility in Vietnam, and aesthetically, I really like Firebase Z. You have this like sheet of purple of this ethereal wall that's contrasted up against the greens and the browns of the jungle, and you know, just from a purely visual perspective, this map is very unique looking. However, that's pretty much where the personality of Firebase Z kind of ends. The main problem I have with this map is it's kind of like D Machine in terms of not having much to do on its own or much personality, and it times that by 10. There's almost nothing in Firebase Z that feels like it's unique or something that is very specific to this map. The only exception to that are the defense rounds, in which an Orda pretty much tries to stomp in and you got to defend it off from turning off the power. That is very unique, but it doesn't go far enough to make Firebase Z something totally independent. And then also the Wonder Weapon is fun. They get rid of the traditional ray gun in this map and replace it with the Ray K rifle, which, to be honest, has some interesting properties. And I think the Ray K is one of the more fun Wonder Weapons in Zombies, period, and it's a great addition to Firebase Z. But that's kind of where its problems sort of just begin. The main Easter egg is not great on this map. It's very average or okay. It's a lot of running back and forth, grabbing things. It's almost like a Black Ops 4 style Easter egg without any of the things that made those Easter eggs interesting. It's very run-of-the-mill, and the boss fight is an actual joke. I've talked about it before, and I've torn this one apart. But this boss fight is literally, it shouldn't even be in the game. It's kind of embarrassing. Like, this Orda can be deleted in about 10 seconds flat or less with the right approach, and it's not even really a boss fight. You deal damage to this like pretty much stationary wall until it's dead, and then a cutscene plays. And that's another area where Firebase Z struggles, and honestly, not just Firebase Z. This goes for almost every Cold War Zombies map. The game has no idea how it wants you to feel. Like, the tone of Firebase Z, it was never clear to me at all. I've been playing this map for like years at this point, and you know, truly doing this quest, you have no idea at any given point how you're supposed to feel. Like, the ending doesn't feel like triumphant or exciting. It's not really like heart-pounding or heartfelt, you know, with Samantha coming out of the dark ether and all that. Like, this map has no clue how it wants to come across, and some maps do it better than others in this game, but for the most part, this is the worst example. It just like, it's so awkward feeling. It's like an AI wrote it, and there's no like actual emotion behind it, which is very strange. I will criticize Black Ops 4 Zombies for its gameplay any day of the week. I have no problem with doing that, but when it comes to things specifically like tone and atmosphere and how the map makes you feel, Black Ops 4 for the most part nails it. Maybe except for maps with like Alpha Omega and maybe Classified or whatever, but for the most part, Black Ops 4 maps are very specific on how you are supposed to feel in the map. Blood of the Dead, it's like the most hopeless and gloomy and doomer and like just depressing environment, and it's very intentional on how that's supposed to make you feel. Like, that's exactly what they're going for, and it radiates, that energy leaks through every corner of the map for sure. But I can't really say any Cold War map has any specific tone that they really catch. So overall, I do think Firebase Z is probably the weakest map in Cold War Zombies, and again, I don't outright hate it, but to me, its biggest sin is that it is the definition of bland, mediocre, and average, especially considering this was Treyarch's like DLC 1 map, which in a lot of ways, they really got to nail it and get right for the rest of the season, and it kind of, you know, again, sets the tone going forward. Firebase Z struggles in every aspect in that way. It gets a lot of gameplay stuff right, and it also is kind of lacking on side Easter eggs just a bit, but for the most part, it's playable, it's okay, it's just not that special. Now, this would bring us to something later in the season that would get added that is quite special in my opinion, and that is Outbreak. Outbreak was a new game mode to Zombies added post-launch, and while it was still alongside these round-based maps, which was super important, this was a totally different spin on the typical formula. This was the open world for Zombies that we had always dreamed about, but it's done in a very interesting way. Essentially, you have this open world filled with loot and everything to help your character progress, but you also have these main objectives in which it kind of blends the best parts of Zombies gameplay from the past into these small little bite-sized segments. Right? Like, you have these holdouts where maybe for a couple of minutes you got to survive a big onslaught, or you need to transport something, etc. Like, you have almost Easter egg steps or survival bits baked into the gameplay that generates in an almost random fashion. You have tons of different maps and different combinations of objectives you can have, plus like different world events and things like that. Outbreak changed a lot from its initial form when it launched on the game, so for players who only played Outbreak right when it came out, it's definitely evolved evolved a lot and morphed since then, and I would say for the better. It also has an interesting system where there are 2 different paths for Easter eggs you can take depending on what you do, which is a super interesting concept. To be fair, the first Easter egg is far better than the second one, and that is mostly to do with the genius of the Legion boss fight. Within the first Easter egg, you unlock the secret area and everything else, so there's a lot going on here, and I think Outbreak could be improved greatly in the future. The biggest problem that it has, or one of the biggest issues, is its tone and atmosphere. Again, very much similar to a lot of the other Cold War Zombies maps. Every single map in Outbreak is basically a fire team map or some kind of like recontextualized multiplayer map. These do not feel like a Zombies atmosphere whatsoever, and that can really hurt not only the personality but the vibe of the entire mode. The main problem with the maps themselves are that they are, again, essentially the same sandbox, but just the only variables that can be altered are the rearranging of these objectives and missions and world events and stuff. So if you don't have anything else meaningful to include in these open spaces, just cut it out of the game, I guess. I think this is going to sound funny, but Vanguard Zombies tried to do that. It almost tried to scale its world down a little bit in its mode with Duran Fong, and I get what they were going for, and they even went for a better Zombies atmosphere, but Vanguard Zombies we're not going to get into in this video. We'll get into that some other day. But for Outbreak specifically, I think Treyarch has the gameplay of Outbreak down. I think the gameplay of Outbreak fundamentally is excellent for the most part. There's a couple objectives I don't really like, but for the most part, they are unbelievably solid, and the Easter egg boss fight is insane. It's great, but they really do struggle on striking a Zombies tone, which, you know, pretty much the rest of the game has a problem with more or less as well. We already know Treyarch is making another version of Outbreak for their next game. Like, we know for a fact it's being worked on, and I think for their second draft, it's going to be even better than this one. The gameplay of Outbreak 1 is amazing. I just think they need to beef up the tone and atmosphere stuff a little bit more, and also the biggest strength of Outbreak, and this is where Vanguard went wrong, Outbreak existed alongside its round-based maps, so meaning you didn't have to, you weren't forced into playing this mode. You could engage with it if you wanted to, but it didn't, you know, run contradictory to it, and it provided so much in-game variety that it was unbelievable, and because of how much it morphed and evolved over as the year went on, the mode only became better and better. So I think they learned a lot from Outbreak 1, and I am looking forward to what they're doing for the second draft of this mode. But that wasn't where it ended. We also got another map called Mauer der Toten. I've had a lot of time to think about my opinions on Cold War Zombies since I made that last retrospective, and I think I've solidified the fact that, for me anyways, Mauer der Toten is my favorite map in Cold War Zombies, period, hands down, and I would probably say it's the best as well. It's got probably the best layout, Easter egg design, boss fight, and side Easter eggs. It seems like Treyarch really found their footing with this map, and a lot of time and effort went into this experience specifically. It's not perfect, but this is what I would say is like the representation of what Cold War Zombies could be when done absolutely right. Mauer der Toten also goes the farthest in establishing some real personality for itself. Yeah, this map uses a lot of assets from the campaign, you know, it's like, again, rearranged campaign assets, but it does a lot that's very unique and that establishes it against the rest of the game, and this is mostly in the form of Klaus, and also the Wonder Weapon formula is really interesting in Mauer der Toten. It's stuff like this that, again, is unique to this map and is in service of the overall tone and feeling of what Mauer der Toten specifically is going for. This map is very memorable, and that also includes how its Easter egg and boss fight work as well, which I think are pretty excellent. The Easter egg is boiled down, you are upgrading Klaus, you need to go around the map and gather these pieces and parts to get him at his maximum potential. Eventually, you break into the secret laboratory, and then you use these like nuclear Ethereum canisters, and then you launch rockets down, and then eventually you fight Valentina in the boss fight in her ethereal form. And I love this boss fight mechanically. It's like a multi-stage fight where she actually has like a real move set. You know, she can do these different typical things, and you have to learn how to respond and react to them, what things counter these moves, etc. Like, it's an actual fight that you got to go around a couple times and really learn it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's the hardest boss fight in the world, but it's a lot of fun, and I just genuinely love playing it. I don't know if it's quite as good as Legion, but it is excellent. Boss fight and main Easter egg are stellar. They are top tier in this map as well, and it's the perfect perfect blend of like some logic puzzle stuff and perfect gameplay design. Another thing, it's a small detail that I really love. When you're opening the safe to get the wonder weapon, in typical zombies maps, when you're like, you know, stationary trying to solve some kind of puzzle, zombies would still be attacking you. When you're on the locker in this map, thank God, zombies will leave you alone. It's like being able to do these steps in peace is such a nice quality of life function that I hope they never go back on. Like, this is excellent. So small detail, but it makes me love the map even more. And another thing they get right totally is side Easter eggs. Again, this is where Treyarch found their footing. It's not the best map for side Easter eggs. We're going to get to that, but there's certainly a lot more going on here than was in D Machine and also Firebase Z. There's this, my favorite side Easter egg is you collect these teddy bear parts and you get put to a totally separate playable space in this club, and after surviving 3 waves, you go and open like this game show door and you get some kind of reward from it. It's just a lot of fun, and you can re-access this every 15 rounds. Like, it's great. That kind of stuff is what zombie players love to hunt for. And again, it's not the best map for side Easter eggs, but it's such a clear step above what they had done previously that it's a shame a lot of people maybe never even got around to playing this map as the season went on. Mauertone also has a really unique approach to its wonder weapon. You know, typically in zombies, you get a wonder weapon, and in order to upgrade it or get its variants, you got to do some kind of quest, etc. In Mauertone, they don't do this at all, which I'm okay with, and I actually like. It was a nice change of pace. But you get the base wonder weapons called the Cerberus. It's like this laser pistol, and as you just get kills, you can pick up different barrels or like variants of said gun, and it will change the effect of it. This was great, and you actually need it for parts in the Easter egg, but the main Easter egg itself is still substantial enough where you didn't need some kind of quest to be able to upgrade these. I think it was excellent. It makes the gameplay of Cold War flow a lot better, and it makes me enjoy this map because it felt distinctly different to everything else we'd been doing. Mauertone certainly isn't perfect, but a lot of my issues with it are literally so minor that it would just feel like nitpicky. One thing I do love is this was the first map in Cold War Zombies to have a brand new Pack-a-Punch camo that isn't the default one, and they look so sexy in this map. I have pretty much nothing but positives to say about Mauertone. I really think that this should be almost the blueprint of Treyarch's maps going forward. If they are still retaining this Cold War style of format and gameplay design, I think Mauertone is an excellent starting point. Of course, it can go a lot farther in a few areas for sure, but in terms of a baseline formula, they've really got it pat down in Mauertone. But it wasn't the final map. We would get DLC 4 called Forsaken. Forsaken, I don't have quite as much praise for in a lot of ways as I did with Mauer, but it is the same premise where, again, it's a lot of the campaign levels sort of rearranged, but Mauertone does it a bit more creatively, in my opinion, whereas Forsaken is just the red light, green light mission layout speaking, and it has so much more wasted space than Mauer. Like, the layout is so unbelievably clunky in Forsaken. I think it's probably its biggest weak point, and I said it before, but I think Forsaken has the worst layout in a zombies map since Die Rise or Moon. It's just not very good, man. You could tell they didn't have the amount of time that they would have liked to curate this for a more zombies-friendly layout. Like, the areas are so disconnected. There's a bunch of shops and random rooms that do not serve any function to the actual map at all, and just straight up don't need to be there. I'm not a big fan of wasted space, especially when it comes to what's supposed to be sort of crafted round-based map, and this map has tons and tons of it. What it does have going for it, however, is a pretty fun main Easter egg, a pretty decent boss fight, but it has downright excellent side Easter eggs, literally the best in the game, and these can range from going into the arcade and interacting with these machines. One of them takes you to the old classic Nocturne Toten in this small mini game, or the other Dreisendrock pinball machine, etc. Like, this has so many good side Easter eggs. There's even like a Perkaholic one you can do. Like, it's excellent. Treyarch really found their footing with this. Yeah, the main Easter egg is a little bit less than stellar. It's not great, but it's okay. I'd say it's very average. And the boss fight is more of a visual spectacle than an actually like masterclass driven designed boss fight, but that's fine. Forsaken all around is still a decent map. I just think the really big thing holding it back is not only the tone, but the layout of the map is actually kind of horrible. The wonder weapon's interesting. You have this Crystallox wonder weapon that is both a melee and an actual projectile weapon, and it has different uses. They sort of feed off each other's ammo. It's very interesting. The side Easter eggs alone literally carry this map from being just a sort of average one to pretty good. Again, it's no top tier map or anything, but I just feel really bad for Treyarch in this case because it's like very clear in this map that this was hindered by the, you know, lack of time or budget or whatever. They had to really scrounge up whatever they had using pieces from the campaign. There is some unique stuff in this map, and again, the boss fight is decent. It's very mediocre. It's middle of the road for me. It's fine, but it's not anything that transcends or like, you know, blows Legion out of the water or anything. It's good, but Forsaken is a weird one to sort of end your DLC season on, but that would be the final round-based map we'd get for Cold War. And as an entire experience, I would really say that Cold War found its gameplay again. Like, this game made me fall in love with why I fell in love with zombies initially, speaking from a gameplay perspective. The area that it struggles in is, of course, really nailing down that zombies tone and atmosphere that had been done so well in the past. And if, you know, Treyarch going forward is able to marry those two things together, we could have an excellent zombies experience. And that's really the only thing that I would say is the weight around its ankle. But Cold War didn't end there. It has another mode called Onslaught that I want to quickly talk about. This was added as essentially like filler content for the PlayStation system only when the game launched, and of course it got added to the Xbox and PC later on. But this mode I think is so like underappreciated. It's very simple. This is just like you load up the map, you're in this safe ring, and you shoot zombies and survive waves. There's no prep you got to do going in. You don't need to look up any guides on how to do stuff. You just get in and shoot zombies. That's literally it. This mode is excellent because you can just turn your brain off, and it's like loading up a zombies map that you have no responsibility for. There's no barrier to entry, and it takes place on virtually every single multiplayer map, giving you tons of like visual variety. And yeah, the gameplay from map to map is pretty much the same. It's, you know, it's just different layouts more or less, but it's fine having these like visual varieties as you play Onslaught. I'm a massive fan of this because it really allows you to test builds and how different weapons interact with certain bosses and so on. You can really see if something's right for you in a round-based map, and you can test that out in Onslaught. And I also feel like it's the easiest kind of content for Treyarch to make. I think this should be a staple going forward. They should just make Onslaught for every multiplayer map that they ever make, and that is just additional content that I'm sure is, once they develop the base mechanics, is not that hard to just copy and paste into all of the others. So now when you consider the zombies offering on Cold War as a whole package, I think it stands just as tall as almost any other zombies that we've had before. Maybe, you know, it does not transcend what Black Ops 3 did in a lot of ways, but it's an alternative if you didn't like Black Ops 4. It has a very similar amount of content, and even, you know, games like Black Ops 1 and 2, I would argue that Cold War has probably a higher variety in its experiences than those games. Yeah, I'd say the round-based maps in those older games were better, but Cold War has a ton of variety, and I think that's undeniable. There's definitely something for everybody here, which is great because that was what they were going for. They wanted to make it accessible for this particular title, and I think they did a good job of that. Is there some things that I think could be changed going forward, or maybe should be more catered towards typical hardcore players? Sure, 100%. Maybe they'll do that in the future titles, but as an entire experience, Cold War Zombies is unbelievably solid, and I have such a fun time playing it every time I ever interact with it. So I hope I've made it clear that despite Cold War being made under like ridiculously strange and pressured circumstances, still came out pretty damn solid. The thing about Cold War is it's got like a good batting average across all its modes. The campaign is pretty good, you know, it's not perfect. The multiplayer struggles a little bit here and there with like tone and stuff like that, but as far as gameplay is also very, very nice. And then also zombies ended up being pretty great by the end of the season. Yeah, it could have been a little bit better, and there's a lot of missed opportunities in every single one of these aspects, for sure. There's no doubt about that. But when you consider the game in its entirety and that it was made literally during the difficulty of the pandemic, like I have a lot of respect for what we did get, and I still find myself playing and enjoying Cold War even to this day, and I probably will for some years to come. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. You are an actual legend, and these videos take me so long to make. It's a ton of work, and I'm a one-man show, but I do it because I love it. And if you want to see these episodes early before anyone else, or you just want to see some cool behind-the-scenes stuff that I'm working on, consider checking out the Patreon. We got a cool little thing going on over there, and you know, you get access to a bunch of cool stuff. So go give it a look if you're interested. Obviously, never feel pressured or obligated, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video regardless, and I will see you in the next one.